I thought I rescued a frozen puppy. 6 months later, a vet told me he wasn't a dog at all. What I pulled from a frozen ditch near Bozeman looked like a dying German Shepherd puppy. But the truth changed everything, and forced me to let him go. The discovery and rescue. It was one of those winter afternoons outside Bozeman when the sun looks warm from a distance but the cold cuts straight through your jacket the moment you step outside. The road was nearly empty, just long stretches of snow-covered fields and frozen ditches on both sides. I had just finished a volunteer shift at the local shelter, the kind of day where you go home tired but feeling like you did something good. The heater in the truck was running full blast, and honestly, my mind was somewhere else, thinking about dinner, thinking about work the next morning. Nothing important. Then I heard it. At first, it barely registered, just a faint sound under the hum of the tires on frozen pavement. Not a bark, not exactly a whine either. It sounded more like something trying to cry but too weak to make any real noise. I slowed down without even thinking about it, the way you do when your instincts kick in before your brain catches up. Up ahead, in the snow-filled ditch along the roadside, there was a dark shape. From a distance, it honestly looked like a piece of trash, maybe a black plastic bag that had blown off the back of a truck. That happens a lot out here. People lose things on the highway and the wind carries them for miles. I almost kept driving. But something didn't feel right. So I pulled over, stepped out into the cold, and walked toward it. The snow crunched under my boots, and the wind hit my face so hard my eyes started watering. I remember squinting against the glare of the snow, trying to figure out what I was looking at. And then it moved. Just a small twitch, so slight I might have missed it if I had blinked. That's when I realized it wasn't trash at all. It was a puppy. Tiny, maybe 8 weeks old at most. Dark gray fur matted with ice, almost blending into the dirty snow around him. Half his body was buried like he had just given up trying to climb out. His paws stuck out at awkward angles, stiff from the cold, and his eyes looked dull and distant, the way animals look when they're already halfway gone. He wasn't shivering anymore, which scared me the most. Anyone who's dealt with hypothermia knows that when the shaking stops, it's usually a bad sign. His chest barely moved. For a second I just knelt there, realizing how close he was to dying, and I remember thinking, if I had driven past 30 seconds later, he probably wouldn't have made it. I slid my hands under him as gently as I could. He didn't fight, didn't squirm, didn't even try to pull away. He felt strangely heavy for something so small, like lifting a wet towel out of a sink. I tucked him inside my coat against my chest, pressing him into the warmth of my sweater and hoping it wasn't already too late. That's when he made the first sound. A tiny breath, shaky and uneven, followed by a broken little howl, so soft it was almost nothing at all. Not loud enough to call for help. Just loud enough to let me know he was still alive. And as I got back into the truck and started the engine, one thought kept running through my mind. What kind of story leaves an 8-week-old puppy alone in a frozen ditch? Because whatever the answer was, I knew this little guy deserved a better ending. That first night was quieter than any night I can remember, and somehow louder at the same time. I laid him down on an old quilt on the kitchen floor. Right near a small space heater I pulled out of the hallway closet. Nothing fancy, just the kind of setup you throw together when you're working on instinct instead of a plan. I filled a couple of bottles with warm water, wrapped them in towels so they wouldn't burn him, and tucked them gently against his tiny body. He barely reacted. No wagging tail, no whining, no curious puppy energy, just slow, shallow breathing and a body that felt too still for something so young. If you've ever cared for a sick animal, or even a sick person, you know that strange kind of time that happens. Minutes feel like hours, every little movement feels important, every breath feels like a question mark. I warmed up a little chicken broth on the stove and let it cool until it was barely lukewarm. When I held the bowl near his nose, he sniffed once, blinked slowly, and managed a few clumsy laps. 3 or 4 small sips. That was it, but somehow it felt like a victory. After that, he turned his head toward the kitchen window, not toward me. Not toward the heater, but toward that dark stretch of land beyond the glass. Snow-covered fields leading to a line of distant hills. He stayed like that until he drifted off to sleep. And I stayed right there with him. I pulled up a chair and sat beside that quilt the entire night. No television, no phone, just the low hum of the heater and the quiet sound of his breathing. Sometimes it got so faint that I had to lean down and slide my hand gently against his ribs, just to make sure his chest was still rising and falling. There were moments when I honestly wasn't sure he would make it until morning. But sometime before dawn, when the sky started turning that pale winter blue, he took a deeper breath than before, then another, and then he let out this thin, shaky little sound in his sleep, not quite a whine, not quite a bark, more like a tiny howl. That was the moment I allowed myself to believe he might actually survive. The next morning, the vet confirmed it: frostbite on the ear tips and paws, dehydration, exhaustion, but his heart was strong and his lungs sounded clear. The vet shook her head and said something that stuck with me. He wasn't supposed to make it. On the drive home, I kept looking over at him curled up in a towel on the passenger seat. This little survivor who had somehow fought his way back from the edge. That's when the name came to me. Quartz. It just felt right, strong and quiet at the same time. Something formed under pressure, something that lasts. And for a while, Quartz started acting like any rescued puppy would. He ate a little more each day, slept a lot, followed me from room to room once he had the strength. But even early on, there were things that didn't quite fit. Most puppies bark at everything: the doorbell, footsteps, the sound of a refrigerator opening. Quartz didn't. Days would go by without a single bark. Instead, he liked to sit on the windowsill in the evenings, perfectly still, watching the hills in the distance like he was waiting for something. Sometimes I would call his name and he wouldn't move right away. Not because he was being stubborn, it felt more like he was listening. And then one night, I heard it. A wolf howling somewhere far out in the dark. Quartz lifted his head slowly, ears forward, eyes fixed on the hills. And after a moment, he opened his mouth and answered with a long, steady howl that seemed far too deep for a puppy his size. I remember feeling a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the cold. Because right then, a quiet question formed in the back of my mind. What exactly had I brought home? When the questions began, at first, I told myself Quartz was just a strong puppy, one of those big, fast-growing shepherd types that fill out earlier than the others. Anyone who's raised dogs knows they all grow at their own pace. Some stay small and lanky for months, and some seem to stretch overnight. So when Quartz started getting bigger, I didn't think much of it. But by the time he reached 4 months old, it was impossible not to notice. He wasn't just growing, he was expanding into something else entirely. When he stood next to other dogs at the shelter, dogs that were already full-grown, he didn't look like a puppy anymore. His legs were longer, his body lean but powerful, and his shoulders were already beginning to fill out. People would stop and stare when I walked him, not in a casual way, in that double-take kind of way. More than once someone asked me, "How old is he?" And when I said 4 months, they usually laughed like I was joking. One man at the feed store looked at Quartz, shook his head, and said, "That dog's gonna be huge." But size wasn't the strangest part. It was the way he moved. Most puppies are clumsy. They bump into furniture, slide on hardwood floors, knock things over with their tails. Quartz never did, even as a young pup. He moved with this quiet, controlled grace that didn't seem learned, it seemed natural. Sometimes I'd turn around and he'd be standing right behind me, and I wouldn't have heard a single step. Not the click of nails on the floor. Not the rustle of movement. Nothing. It wasn't spooky exactly, just different. Like he carried himself with a kind of purpose most house dogs never develop. And then there was the fence. My backyard fence wasn't anything special, just a standard wooden barrier. About 5 feet high, plenty for most dogs, At first, Quartz treated it like any puppy would, sniffing around the edges and chasing birds that landed too close. But after a while, I noticed something else. He didn't just run along the fence, he studied it. He'd walk slowly from post to post, nose low, stopping at certain spots as if memorizing them. Sometimes he'd push gently against the boards, testing them, not frantic, not destructive, just curious in a very focused way. Like he was trying to understand how the barrier worked. One afternoon, a deer ran across the far end of the property. And before I could even react, Quartz sprinted toward the fence in 2 long, effortless strides. He didn't jump that day, but the way he gathered himself told me he probably could. That realization stayed with me. Because raising a dog is one thing. Trying to contain something built to roam miles every day is something else entirely. Still, I might have ignored all of it if it hadn't been for the pictures. One evening I snapped a few photos of Quartz standing by the back door. The light hit his coat just right, dark gray with lighter streaks along his shoulders, and his eyes looked almost silver in the camera. I posted the pictures online, mostly just to share how far he'd come since that frozen night in the ditch. Within an hour, the comments started rolling in. At first they were simple. "Beautiful dog. Wow, he's stunning." Then the tone started to change. One person wrote, "Is that a wolf dog?" Another said, "He looks too wild to be just a shepherd." And then the question that showed up again and again, "Are you sure that's a dog?" I remember sitting there staring at the screen longer than I want to admit. Because deep down, part of me had already started wondering the same thing. By the time Quartz was about 5 months old, the questions had stopped being casual and started feeling serious. Friends mentioned it, strangers mentioned it, even people at the shelter, folks who had worked with dogs for years, would watch him for a while and then quietly say something like, "There's something different about that one." Eventually, during one of our regular vet visits, the conversation shifted in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. The vet watched Quartz walk across the exam room floor, not sniffing randomly like most young dogs, but moving in slow circles, alert to every sound in the hallway. His ears would turn before footsteps even reached the door. His eyes followed movement with a kind of focus that felt older than his age. After a few minutes, she leaned back and said gently, "I think it might be worth talking to a wildlife specialist." Not because Quartz was aggressive, he wasn't. Not because he was dangerous, at least not then. But because understanding what he was might matter for how he should live. So we scheduled an appointment. The specialist didn't rush in with excitement the way most people did when they saw Quartz. She didn't reach down to pet him. She just stood quietly for a moment and watched, the way someone watches an animal instead of a pet. She noticed how he positioned himself where he could see the door. How he shifted when unfamiliar sounds echoed in the hallway. How he stayed calm, but never completely relaxed. After a while, she said something simple. "I think we should run a DNA test. Just to be sure." It sounded reasonable enough. A blood sample, a little paperwork, and a few weeks of waiting. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a mix of shepherd and husky. Something like that. Plenty of dogs have unusual traits. But waiting has a way of making your imagination work overtime. Every time Quartz sat at the window. Every time he moved silently across the floor. Every time he lifted his head at the sound of distant howling. I wondered. And then the results came in. We were back in the same exam room. Quartz lay stretched out on the cool floor, calm as ever, his head resting on his paws like this was just another ordinary visit. If you didn't know better, you'd think he was just a well-behaved young dog. The specialist and the vet stood by the computer reading the report. They didn't speak right away, and that silence felt heavier than bad news. Finally, the screen turned toward me. There it was in plain numbers. Quartz wasn't just unusual. He wasn't just a big shepherd mix. He was approximately 70% wolf, 30% German shepherd, a high-content wolfdog. I remember staring at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, because the animal lying at my feet was the same one I had carried home inside my coat. The same one that followed me from room to room. The same one that trusted me completely. But suddenly the picture was bigger than that. The specialist explained it calmly. Animals like Quartz aren't meant for small yards or ordinary routines. They need space, real space. Secure enclosures, mental challenges, a structured environment that respects their instincts instead of trying to suppress them. They aren't bad animals. They're just different. Then she said something I've never forgotten. Love is not always enough. At first, that sentence felt wrong. Because loving him was the reason he survived. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood what she meant. Sometimes love saves an animal. And sometimes love means recognizing when your home isn't the place they truly belong. Sitting there with Quartz pressed quietly against my boot, one question kept echoing in my mind. If he wasn't meant to live like a dog, what kind of life was he meant for? Choosing what was best for Quartz. After the DNA results, life didn't suddenly change overnight. Quartz still followed me through the house like he always had. He still rested near the door when I took off my boots. He still leaned into my hand when I scratched behind his ears. On the surface, everything looked the same. But inside, something had shifted. Once you know the truth, you can't unknow it. Every time Quartz paced along the fence line, I noticed it differently. Every time he sat at the window staring toward the hills, it felt less like a habit and more like a pull, like part of him belonged somewhere I couldn't reach. The house that once felt like a safe place started to feel small. Not unsafe. Just wrong for what he was becoming. The vet and the specialist both said the same thing in different ways. Quartz needed more than love and good intentions. He needed space to run, room to explore, and an environment built for animals that still carried wild instincts. A typical home, even a caring one, wasn't designed for a high-content wolfdog. So I started researching. Late nights at the kitchen table with the laptop open, reading articles, watching videos, learning things I had never needed to know before. I learned that wolfdogs often struggle in ordinary homes, not because they're bad animals, but because their instincts don't disappear just because we bring them indoors. They think differently, they react differently, they need stimulation and freedom in ways most pets never do. Eventually, I found a sanctuary up in the mountains a couple of hours away. The photos showed large wooded enclosures with tall fencing and double gates. Trees and rocks and open space. Animals that looked strong and alert, not confined, but protected. Staff who understood behavior most people never see up close. I called them and told Quartz's story. How I found him. How he survived. What the DNA test showed. They listened patiently and asked thoughtful questions, not just about his size and health, but about his habits, how he reacted to new people, how he handled stress, what he did when he heard other animals. A few days later they wrote back and said something simple. He sounds like a good candidate. That sentence should have made me feel relieved. Instead, it made everything real. Because agreeing with them meant admitting something I didn't want to admit, that the best place for Quartz might not be with me. People like to say that if you love an animal enough, you can make anything work. I used to believe that. It sounds comforting. It sounds loyal. But real love is more complicated than that. Real love sometimes asks a harder question. Are you holding on for them, or for yourself? At night Quartz still climbed onto the windowsill like always, watching the dark stretch of hills beyond the fields. When distant howls drifted through the cold air, he answered without hesitation, long, steady calls that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. And each time I heard it, I understood a little more. Part of him had always been reaching toward that world. Meanwhile, I was sitting in a quiet house trying to convince myself that keeping him close was the same thing as caring for him. The truth was harder. I loved him. There was no question about that. But loving him meant facing a decision I never expected to make. Because sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel like a victory. Sometimes it feels like loss. And deep down, I knew that if Quartz was ever going to live the life he was meant for, I might have to be the one who let him go. The drive to the sanctuary felt longer than it really was. Maybe because I knew that every mile brought us closer to a moment I wasn't sure I was ready for. The road climbed into the mountains, winding past snow-covered trees and open stretches of quiet land that looked untouched for miles. Quartz rode in the backseat like he always did, calm, alert, watching the world pass by through the window. Every now and then he lifted his head and sniffed the air coming through the vents, as if he could already sense we were heading somewhere different. When we finally pulled in, the first thing I noticed was the fencing. Not the kind of fence you see in a backyard. These were tall, reinforced barriers with double gates and wide enclosures stretching back into the trees. Everything about the place felt solid and intentional, built not just to keep animals in, but to keep them safe. Inside the enclosures were things you'd never find in a normal yard: fallen logs, rock ledges, shaded areas, open running space. It didn't look like a kennel. It looked like a piece of the wilderness carefully protected. And moving through that space were the animals. Wolf dogs of all sizes and colors, some pale and almost white, others dark like quartz. They moved with the same quiet confidence I had seen in him since he was young. Heads up, ears turning, bodies always aware of their surroundings. The staff didn't rush the introduction. No excitement, no pressure, just calm observation. They wanted to see how Quartz would react. And honestly, so did I. When he stepped out of the truck, he didn't hesitate. He stood still for a moment, nose lifted, drawing in the mountain air like he was reading a story written in scent. His posture changed, not tense, not nervous, just focused in a way I hadn't seen before. Like he recognized something. We started with a simple introduction through the fence. A couple of the resident wolf dogs trotted over. Curious but relaxed, they pressed their noses gently against the wire, tails moving in slow, easy arcs. Quartz walked forward to meet them. No fear. No aggression. Just quiet confidence. They sniffed through the mesh for a moment, exchanging information in a language that didn't need words. One of the older wolf dogs nudged him lightly through the fence, almost like a greeting, and Quartz shifted his weight to stay balanced before leaning forward to sniff back. Watching that moment, something inside me settled. Because for the first time since I had found him in that frozen ditch, Quartz didn't look like an outsider trying to adapt. He looked like he belonged. The handlers eventually moved us to a double gate area where the animals could get closer safely. Even there, Quartz stayed steady, alert but calm, reading the other animals the same way they read him. It struck me how natural it all seemed. No training commands. No leash corrections. No encouragement from me. Just instinct meeting instinct. These were animals that moved like him, thought like him, lived by the same quiet rules he seemed to understand without being taught. Standing there, I realized something important. Back at home, Quartz had always felt like a remarkable dog. Here, he looked completely ordinary. And strangely enough, that was the most comforting thing of all. Because sometimes the best place for someone, or something, isn't where they stand out. It's where they fit in. I still go back to see him, almost every weekend, if I can. The drive out to the sanctuary has become part of my routine now, the same long road, The same quiet stretch of trees. The same feeling building in my chest as I get closer. There's something comforting about knowing he's out there, living a life that finally makes sense for him. When I arrive, I usually walk the same path along the fence line. And almost every time, before I even spot him, I feel it, that strange awareness that he knows I'm there. Then I see movement in the distance, a familiar shape weaving through the grass. And then he appears. Older now, stronger, more confident. He doesn't run to me the way he used to. Not like before. Back then, he would press himself against me, desperate for attention, as if I were the only safe place in his world. Now it's different. Now he approaches calmly, almost with quiet dignity. He pauses a few feet away, watching me with those same intelligent eyes. And yes, he still remembers me. You can see it in the way his ears lift slightly, the way his tail moves, not wildly, just enough, the way he stands close for a moment before wandering off again. Some people ask me if that hurts, if it feels like losing him all over again. But the truth is, it doesn't. Because the biggest difference is this: he doesn't need me anymore. And that's something most people misunderstand about love. We tend to think love means being needed, being the center of someone's world, being the one they depend on. But sometimes the purest form of love is helping someone grow beyond you. When he lived with me, he depended on me for everything: food, safety, direction, comfort. His entire world was limited by what I could provide. And no matter how much I cared, that world was always going to be too small. Now his world is bigger than I ever could have made it. Now he runs with others like him. He explores. He chooses where to go, who to be near, when to rest. He belongs to a place that understands what he is, not as a pet, not as a problem, but simply as himself. Sometimes when I stand there watching him disappear into the trees, I realize something important. Letting go didn't mean abandoning him. It meant trusting that he deserved more than what I could give. And maybe you've faced a moment like that in your own life, a time when doing the right thing felt exactly like breaking your own heart. A time when holding on would have been easier than stepping back. Those choices define us. Not the comfortable ones, the hard ones. So when I leave the sanctuary and head back down that long road home, I carry a quiet kind of peace with me. Because I know he's safe. I know he's where he belongs. And most of all, I know that giving him a life without me was the greatest gift I could ever give him. Sometimes I think back to the day we first met, a small, uncertain pup with oversized paws and curious eyes. At the time, I believed I was doing something simple, something good. I thought I had rescued a puppy, a lonely animal that needed a home, needed protection, needed someone willing to care. And for a while, that story made sense. I fed him, trained him, sat with him through long nights when he wouldn't settle down. I tried to give him the kind of life any dog might want: a warm place to sleep, a yard to explore, a human who cared. From the outside, it looked like a rescue story with a happy ending already written. But life has a way of showing us truths we didn't expect. Because the older he got, the clearer it became, he wasn't meant for the life I had imagined. There was something deeper in him, something restless, something ancient. You could see it in the way he watched the horizon, the way he lifted his head at distant sounds no one else noticed. And eventually I understood something that changed me forever. I didn't rescue a puppy. What I really did was help something wild find its way home. Out there, beyond the fences and the roads, when the sun begins to drop behind the hills, sometimes the sanctuary grows quiet, and then it happens, a long, rising howl rolling across the landscape. Not a cry for help, not a sound of loneliness, but a voice that belongs exactly where it is. The first time I heard it, I just stood there and listened, and I realized that sound wasn't about the past, it was about freedom. About identity. About becoming what you were always meant to be. Maybe that's what real compassion looks like. Not shaping something into what we want, but giving it the chance to be what it already is. So if you ever find yourself holding on to something, or someone, ask yourself one question. Are you protecting them? Or are you holding them back? Because sometimes the greatest act of love isn't rescue. Sometimes, it's letting the wild run free.